Today's case is one of the most infamous crimes in Australian history. In 1986, a couple from Perth named David and Catherine Birnie carried out a series of crimes that would shock the entire country. Over the span of just a few weeks, several young women crossed paths with them. By the time it was over, 4 women had lost their lives, and only one had managed to escape. The case would later become known as the Moorhouse murders. But long before the headlines, before the investigation, and before anyone knew what David and Catherine were capable of, both of them had already lived through troubled and complicated childhoods. David Birnie grew up in Wattle Grove, one of Perth's outer suburbs. People who knew the family back then would later describe the Birnie household in almost the exact same way: dysfunctional. There always seemed to be rumors surrounding them. Neighbors talked about constant arguments, alcohol problems, and allegations of infidelity. Whether all of those stories were true or not, the family had a reputation, and it wasn't a good one. Even the minister who officiated David's parents' wedding later admitted that he had doubts about the marriage from the very beginning. Years later, he said the couple never seemed compatible and that he'd always had a feeling their relationship wouldn't end well. David himself would later describe his childhood home as chaotic. According to him, family meals were rare, and his parents paid very little attention to their children. As David got older, the family moved to another suburb of Perth. It was around that time that he met a girl named Catherine Harrison through mutual friends. At first, there was nothing remarkable about the relationship. But years later, those 2 teenagers would become one of the most notorious criminal couples Australia had ever seen. David wasn't interested in school for very long. He dropped out early and, by the age of 15, was already working at a horse riding center. People who knew him during those years would later say there were warning signs even then. Something about him seemed off. And whatever those early problems were, they only became more obvious as time went on. During his teenage years, David had multiple encounters with police and began building a criminal record long before his name ever appeared in a newspaper. At some point, he married and became the father of a daughter named Tanya. Years later, when David was finally arrested, Tanya was only 10 years old. As an adult, Tanya made a choice she never regretted. She never married and never had children. When asked why, her answer was blunt: "I don't want another David Birnie brought into this world." Catherine's background was just as troubled in its own way. She was born in 1951. When Catherine was only 2 years old, her mother died while giving birth to her younger brother. The baby survived for just 2 days. Unable to care for her alone, Catherine's father placed her in the care of her maternal grandparents. A few years later, he took her back, and Catherine returned to live with him. She first met David when she was only 12 years old. 2 years later, the two began a relationship. Her father did everything he could to stop it, but the harder he pushed, the less Catherine seemed willing to listen. And from his perspective, the concern was understandable. David was constantly finding himself in trouble. If he wasn't dealing with the police, he was involved in some other kind of problem. Trouble seemed to follow him wherever he went. The more people tried to pull David and Catherine apart, the more determined they seemed to stay together. That didn't mean their relationship was completely uninterrupted, though. For a while, Catherine actually stepped away from David. Part of that was influenced by time she'd spent in detention as a teenager, an experience that briefly made her rethink the direction her life was taking. After her release, she started working as a housekeeper for the McLaughlin family. Not long after, she married one of the family's sons shortly after turning 21. Over the years, they had 7 children together. But their family life wasn't without heartbreak. Their first child, a baby boy, was killed in a car accident before he even had the chance to grow up. In the end, the marriage fell apart. Then, in 1985, Catherine made a decision that would change the course of several lives. She left her husband, left behind her 6 surviving children, and moved in with David. The two never legally married, but from that point on, Catherine took the surname Birnie and presented herself as David's wife. What followed was a series of crimes that shocked Australia. Over a period of just 5 weeks, 5 women between the ages of 15 and 31 crossed paths with David and Catherine Birnie. Only one of them would survive. The woman who ultimately escaped was also their final victim. Just a day after being abducted, she managed to get away and went straight to the police. Her escape led investigators directly to the Birnie's home and finally brought the couple's crimes to an end. One of the women targeted by the pair was 22-year-old Mary Nielsen. Mary was a psychology student at the University of Western Australia. Alongside her studies, she worked part-time at a local grocery store. Nothing about her first interaction with David seemed especially alarming. She had visited an auto parts warehouse where he worked, looking for parts for her car. David offered to help her find inexpensive tires and gave her his phone number. It seemed like a harmless favor. On October 6, 1986, Mary went to David's house. She never realized she was walking into a carefully planned trap. The moment she arrived, she was restrained. David assaulted her while Catherine stood by and watched. Later, the couple drove her to Glen Eagles National Park near Albany Highway in Bedfordale. The abuse continued there. Eventually, Mary was killed with a nylon cord. What happened afterward made the crime even more disturbing. David later admitted that he stabbed Mary's body several times after her death. According to him, he'd once read that doing so would speed up decomposition and make a body harder to identify. Believing that, he carried out the act before burying Mary in a shallow grave. Roughly 2 weeks later, David and Catherine found another victim, 15-year-old Susan Candy. Susan was hitchhiking along Sterling Highway in Claremont when she encountered the couple. At the time, she was a high-achieving student at Hollywood Senior High School and lived with her family in Nedlands. Her father was one of the most respected eye surgeons in Western Australia. When Susan suddenly vanished, her family immediately knew something was wrong. Police were notified, and the search for her began. Meanwhile, Susan was being held captive by David and Catherine. During her captivity, they forced her to write letters to her family. The letters were designed to reassure them, to make it seem as though she was safe, had left voluntarily, and wasn't in any danger. But the messages had the opposite effect. The more Susan's family read them, the more uneasy they became. Something about the situation didn't feel right, and deep down, they feared that whatever had happened to Susan was far worse than the letters suggested. The moment Susan got into the car, she realized something was wrong. A knife was pressed against her, her hands were tied, and she was taken back to the Birnie's house. Once there, she was restrained and held captive in a way that followed a pattern investigators would later see again and again throughout the case. After David was finished, Catherine got onto the bed beside Susan and attempted to kill her with a nylon cord. But partway through, she broke down and couldn't go through with it. David then gave Susan a large amount of sleeping medication, supposedly to calm her down. When the teenager eventually fell asleep, he placed the cord around her neck and turned to Catherine. According to the case file, he told her that if she truly loved him, she needed to prove it. Investigators later concluded that David pressured Catherine into carrying out the killing herself while he stood by and watched. Years later, during questioning, Catherine was asked why she had done it. Her answer shocked even experienced investigators. "I wanted to see how strong I was inside." She later added, "I didn't feel anything. It was exactly what I expected. I was prepared to follow him to the end of the world and do whatever it took to give him what he wanted." Then, after a brief pause, she made another disturbing statement. She was a woman. Women hurt men. They destroy them. After Susan's death, her body was buried in the same forest where Mary Nielsen had already been laid to rest. Then, on November 1st, another woman entered David and Catherine's path. 31-year-old Nolene Patterson. Nolene managed a bar at the Nedlands Golf Club. On the day she disappeared, she was heading home after work when her car broke down near Canning Highway. She had run out of fuel and was stranded on the side of the road, waiting for help. When David and Catherine stopped and offered her a ride, she accepted. Almost immediately, she realized she had made a terrible mistake. She was threatened, restrained, and driven to the couple's house on Morehouse Street. According to investigators, what happened next followed a pattern that had already become familiar in the case. Like the victims before her, Nolene was held captive inside the house while David repeatedly abused her. By this point, the couple's crimes had become frighteningly methodical. At first, David intended to kill Nolene that same night. Then, unexpectedly, he changed his mind. Instead, he decided to keep her alive for a few more days. Nolene remained captive for 3 days. And during that time, something unusual seemed to happen. According to later accounts, David became strangely attached to her. Catherine noticed it too. The situation fueled intense jealousy, and before long she confronted David with an ultimatum. Either Nolene had to die, or she would take her own life. After that confrontation, events moved quickly. David gave Nolene a large quantity of sleeping medication, and while she was unconscious, he killed her. Afterward, her body was taken to Glen Eagles and buried in the same general area as the previous victims. By this point, Nolene had become the third victim. But what happened during her burial would later leave a lasting impression on investigators. Even among all the disturbing details that emerged from the case, Catherine's behavior stood out. According to later reports, she appeared strangely fascinated by the burial itself and seemed to take particular interest in covering Nolene's face with soil. What unsettled detectives even more was Catherine's attitude afterward. It wasn't something she said. It was the complete lack of emotion. Investigators later remarked that she showed little remorse, little sadness, and almost no reaction to what had happened. And somehow the worst was still yet to come. Just a few days later, David and Catherine found another victim. Her name was Denise Brown. She was 21 years old and waiting for a bus near Sterling Highway when the couple pulled over and offered her a ride. There was nothing about the situation that seemed unusual, so Denise got in. It didn't take long to realize she'd made a terrible mistake. Almost as soon as the car pulled away, the threats began. Like the women before her, Denise was taken back to the house on Morehouse Street. By then, David and Catherine had fallen into a pattern. Different victim, same nightmare. The next day, Denise was dead. Her body was loaded into a vehicle and taken to a remote bushland area where the couple intended to bury her and erase any trace of what had happened. But according to investigators, David's crimes didn't end with murder. Some of the details that emerged later were so disturbing that even experienced detectives struggled to talk about them. The case files describe a series of degrading acts involving Denise's body, both on the drive to the burial site and after they arrived. At one point, David also used a knife to make sure she was dead. Eventually, they began digging the grave. But even that didn't go smoothly. The hole wasn't deep enough. Part of Denise's body remained exposed. According to the investigation, David then took additional steps to conceal the remains before finally covering the grave and leaving the area. Denise became the fourth victim, and she almost wasn't the last. The next person David and Catherine targeted was 17-year-old Kate Moyer. Just like the others, she accepted a ride. Just like the others, she ended up inside the house. But unlike the others, Kate was about to bring everything crashing down. After being taken to the house, she looked directly at her captors and asked a question that was as chilling as it was heartbreaking. "Are you going to kill me? Or are you going to rape me?" David and Catherine told her that as long as she behaved herself, she wouldn't be killed. Over the next day, Kate was held captive inside the house. At times, the couple forced her to dance for their entertainment. At night, she was made to sleep in the same bed as them, handcuffed to David. About 24 hours into her captivity, David forced Kate to call her mother. Holding a knife to her throat, he listened as she told her mom that she'd had too much to drink and had spent the night at a friend's house. But Kate wasn't really trying to reassure her. If anything, she was hoping her mother would hear that something was wrong, because anyone who knew Kate knew that story didn't make sense. Heavy drinking simply wasn't something she did. The following day, everything changed. David left for work. Around the same time, one of the couple's friends stopped by the house to drop something off for Catherine. In the middle of the distraction, Catherine made a mistake. A mistake that would end up destroying everything. She forgot to chain Kate to the bed. For the first time since being abducted, Kate was alone. And free. She moved fast. The window was locked, but she managed to force it open and squeeze through. As she jumped outside, the Birnie's dog attacked her. Even then, she didn't stop. She fought the dog off and kept running. On November 10, 1986, a terrified and breathless Kate burst into a nearby store and told the people inside that someone was trying to kill her. When police arrived, she told them everything: the kidnapping, the abuse, and the fact that she believed she would have been murdered if she hadn't escaped. At first, not everyone believed her. The story sounded almost unbelievable. But what convinced investigators wasn't just Kate's account. It was the details. She knew the address. She knew the phone number. And she knew dozens of small things that only someone who had actually been inside that house could have known. David and Catherine had used false names around her the entire time. But Kate had spotted David's real name on a prescription bottle and remembered it. Piece by piece, her story started lining up with reality. She also told investigators that she'd watched the movie Rocky while she was being held captive. And to pass the time, she'd drawn a design on the floor inside the house. When police entered the property, they found exactly what Kate had described. The drawing was still there, and the Rocky videotape was still sitting in the VCR. At that point, investigators knew they were dealing with a genuine victim. David and Catherine were arrested shortly afterward. Once in custody, however, their stories couldn't have been more different. Catherine claimed she had never even seen Kate before. David, meanwhile, insisted that Kate had come to the house voluntarily and that everything that happened had been consensual. But those explanations didn't hold up for long. As the pressure of the investigation mounted, David eventually began talking. Not only did he confess to the crimes involving Kate, he also admitted responsibility for the earlier murders. He then led investigators to the burial sites. Before long, detectives were standing over graves that nobody outside the killers had known existed. With the discovery of 4 burial sites, the case was effectively solved. But even then, many investigators remained convinced that the true number of victims was higher than anyone had been able to prove. Even after the arrests, some investigators weren't convinced they had uncovered everything. There were lingering questions about whether David and Catherine Birnie had been involved in other unsolved disappearances. Police looked into a possible connection to Cheryl Renwick, who vanished in May 1986, and Barbara Western, who disappeared just a month later. Another name that surfaced during the investigation was Lisa Marie Mott. Some detectives wondered whether David could have been responsible for her disappearance back in 1980. But the theory never went anywhere. David's first wife told police he had been with her throughout the day Lisa disappeared, and investigators never found enough evidence to prove otherwise. When David Birnie finally stood before the court, he pleaded guilty to 4 murders, along with charges connected to the abduction and assault of Kate Moyer. When asked why he had confessed, he pointed to the victims' families and said, "It's the least I could do." For many people, those words rang hollow. In the end, David received 4 life sentences. Catherine's case followed shortly afterward. Once she was found mentally fit to stand trial, the Supreme Court of Western Australia sentenced her to 4 life terms as well. At the time, the law required both of them to serve at least 20 years before they could even be considered for parole. David was initially sent to Fremantle Prison, but prison wasn't any kinder to him than the outside world. According to reports, he quickly became a target for other inmates and was repeatedly attacked. Because of that, authorities moved him to the prison's former death row unit, where he remained until Fremantle Prison closed in 1990. Even behind bars, David and Catherine tried to maintain their relationship. They were never allowed face-to-face contact, so letters became their only way of communicating. Over the years, they reportedly exchanged more than 2,000 letters. Then, nearly 2 decades after the murders, David's story came to an end. On October 7, 2005, at around 4:30 in the morning, prison officers found him dead inside his cell at Casuarina Prison. He was 54 years old. Authorities concluded that he had taken his own life. No one can know exactly what was going through David's mind in those final days, but investigators later pointed to several possible factors. One report suggested he no longer had access to his antidepressant medication, which may have worsened his depression. There were also reports that he had spent years being targeted and mistreated by other prisoners. Ironically, one former prison officer later described him as a model prisoner, a description many people found difficult to reconcile with the crimes he had committed. Catherine wasn't even allowed to attend his funeral. While David's story ended there, Catherine's did not. She remained at Bandyup Women's Prison, where she spent years working as the prison librarian and even appeared in a prison production of Nonsense. In 2007, her parole application was denied. Another review was scheduled for January 2010, but events took a different turn before that date arrived. On March 14, 2009, Western Australia's new Attorney General, Christian Porter, acted on requests from the victims' families and ordered that Catherine remain imprisoned for the rest of her life. The decision made her only the third woman in Australian history to receive a sentence that effectively guaranteed she would never be released. Before Catherine, only Catherine Knight and Patricia Byers had received similar orders. Another parole application was rejected in 2016. Years later, Kate Moyer, the only survivor of the Birnie's crimes, revealed that David had never once applied for parole. Then, in 2017, Catherine's youngest son, Peter, made a public plea that shocked many people. He asked the courts to have his own mother executed. According to Peter, he had spent years dealing with threats, harassment, and abuse simply because he was Catherine Birnie's son. Today, Catherine Birnie remains behind bars at Bandyup Women's Prison on the outskirts of Perth. At the time this video was made, she was 74 years old. David Birnie is gone. Catherine Birnie is still in prison. But for the families of Mary, Susan, Nolene, and Denise, the consequences of what happened in 1986 never truly went away. Until next time, take care of yourselves and take care of each other.